Fantastic. So, oh boy, here we are. All should be working. Let's see. If it doesn't, we go with the flow. So today we will continue where we left off from the technical art, focusing now on VFX. Just like previously, what did anyone do any VFX so far by many means? At least nobody here. Okay, few online. Excellent. How many of you are interested in VFX by any chance? Kinda. All right. So we are going today go through some of the practical things, what VFX, I mean, what is it all about, what VFX artist does, and overall what to consider as well as some of the best practices. But let's see now, let's see how this, yes. And here I will do, there we go. So just like with the technical art, we will also cover these in this sort of pretty much the same structure. So what does the VFX or visual effects artist do? Well, the biggest role of VFX is actually to communicate the necessary information for whatever it is that the user needs to focus on. So this is where we put more detail to things, especially any kind of movement, action, reaction, and so on. So it's really boosting up the overall experience of what we want someone to focus on. You can literally use VFX to guide the user what they do on the screen. So if anyone played Ghost of Tsushima or any other of the kind of like, I mean, also same goes with given Assassin's Creed games and whatnot. The wind, for example, you follow the wind as if you like to where your target is and so on, like let's engage. But VFX is not just for games. Overall, with any interactive media, they have a huge role. And usually it's the most diverse art form because, of course, there is a technical side of things, which we will be touching upon, but also how do we manage all of that from the visual, like communication? Because really the main role of VFX is communication, like really figuring out what are the main things that one is to focus on and where is the initial or immediate action taking place. So to be a VFX artist, one basically should know, if nothing else, basis, or at least be literate in both technical side, but also art theory, the stuff we have been doing here in the very beginning. So basically, with these basics that we touched upon in this course, you should be having more than enough to proceed forward with playing around with any of these fields, including, of course, visual effects. And animation here, at least the principles of animation, again, that we went through in this course, should be, again, good enough base upon which now you are aware of what to keep in mind when structuring the movement. Because as mentioned, movement has to follow the whole vision and the pretty much the whole story, what is supposed to happen. So it's not just at the like what feels or looks cool. It has way broader meaning than that. So what we are going to touch upon is also the real-time visual effects. So the things that happen literally in real time, and also how things are done and which different techniques and methods there are when it comes to VFX. But here, unlike in technical artist role, you don't necessarily have to be that techy. Just say it doesn't, because there are so many tools, so many different, literally even support options that you don't have to go really fully into tech like technical artists have, especially building these systems, building the tools and so on. Here is more like you're using these tools. But of course, if you are extra nerdy and enjoy it, then of course you can make even more modified visual effects solutions for your team or whoever else might be needing it. But we won't be touching that, especially because usually VFX mostly focus on the communication and very often in line with the animation. So you will see, it will make sense very soon. All right, so what are the real-time visual effects? There is, just like in technical art, there's no, unfortunately, the one way or the recipe how to do something. Because again, every project, doesn't matter if it's interactive or is it static, like movies, I mean, marketing material, website designs, like whatever you might be having that you want to have special effects somewhere with any type of, and again, is it interactive or static? That also brings a lot of kind of like how things should be done. Because the sequencing, it's really important of when happens what, even more than in interactive, because that depends on the player. When you have a static one, when you have a linear experience of, let's say, like in movies or in any kind of like art forms of like, let's say, artists exhibitions and video arts and whatnot they do. So basically, that's the first thing. And even if you do use the same meshes, the same trails, the same kind of stuff, all these can be literally done in different way by different artists. So there is no like one way or highway. It's really about, at the end of the day, it's how does it look? How does it feel? Very similar to animation. But because we have so many different tools that different teams might be using, and again, do you use, for example, even if you use Unreal Engine do you use it for movie production? Do you use it for game production? Or do you use it for both? For example, there are some studios that use for transmedia. For example, there is one that I am slightly more familiar with because we collaborate. They're working on some of our projects. So they are an animation studio, but they're also now working on their own game. So they're planning to use Unreal Engine, not just for their animated movie, but also at the same time, using the same assets and everything else, and kind of like hitting two flies at once, to also use the same environment or similar, at least kind of like it's a separate project, but similar environment for the game that would be in that universe. Which is quite fascinating when you think about it. That is very much doable nowadays. So automatically you can do transmedia. And then when it comes to, again, other tools that might be, so you might be implementing something that it's done in, for example, animation or any other 3D modeling or generally art production tools, from Photoshop, Blender to anything else. And now you need to implement to, again, game engine or some other basically software solution. Then compatibility, fixing up. So again, there has to be some, there are different ways to tackle it. But it's really about what we want to communicate to the user. So usually what we try to do in interactive media. So again, I'm talking here about interactive media, not static ones like movies. We usually try to do everything in the engine itself, meaning that particle systems are the most common systems that we use for a variety of different solutions, because you can even layer different particle effects with completely different rules. They're still particle effects, but they will give completely different things that might happen on top of each other. And plus with the animation, to follow the animation principles, they can feel like absolutely, mind-blowing effects. So you can do a lot of things just with simple particle effects. And we'll talk soon about what actually particle effect system, how they usually work, but we usually try to have everything inside the engine when we work on any interactive systems. Now, based on the animation principles, which we went through, so pretty much these are very useful here because visual effects have to follow the rule of the world that you're presenting. So here we have Katie's screenshot. Oh, wait. I just see that this one didn't go. There we go. So Katie's screenshot. So here's, for example, how different characters, how the world itself might have. For example, imagine that there would be some environmental effects, let's say wind, storm, you name it. These would also be then have to follow. So the reads have to follow the movement and the rules of the movement that we have in that world. And also when what gets triggered when we have a specific action between these different objects, characters, however you name it. And that's where staging, if you remember in the animation, the staging principle is super, super important because this is where we are figuring out when it comes to literal timing, that everything like really clicks together. What is the intensity? What is the timing? What is also possibly contrasting density of the effect where something happens? Just think about simple, like bomb effect. So you have some missile, whatever, hitting something and there is explosion. And that explosion has, as an animation, multiple parts, but VFX on top of it that makes it even more believable are then we are also figuring out how the density changes. For example, it's more dense stuff at the very impact and then it starts scattering away. Or if you have a flying fireball, for example, and then even that we are having the animation of it, but then how the end is kind of like disintegrated, like how the fire effect is kind of like disappearing, is part that we do with sometimes just with simple particle effect system and so on. So that's why staging is really important, because we also have to figure out what is the area, how are these things, because they're usually in a very specific area, and the way how they might even further interact with something else. But the area of effect is something that we also need to be very precise about, which again can be slightly more challenging when you have environments such as games, because we also, just like we spoke about animation, it is really important to be clear what is our main basically action at the time, what we might be doing next, what is like this sort of where the threat comes from, and if we do some effect, some action, that it's very clear what effect it does. So when you see like this, when you have a lot of enemies, when you have a lot of stuff, it can be very messy if you don't do the staging correct. And then of course, this is where it comes the visual hierarchy, which we also spoke a bit about, like how are you communicating that interaction? So again, what comes first, what happens next, and generally scripting that sort of overall experience. And what we can do also is that, of course, with the different type of shapes and colors in particular, just like what we did so far in the theory and went through it with the character design and so on, we are also shaping and designing the shapes and behavior and the colors of the effects that these can change as the effect happens. Think about, again, it can be some impact. So it can be something from, let's say, pure white as it hits, that's the biggest impact. And from there it gets into the burning red and then become something else forward, you know, it can become into a smoke, black smoke or whatever. The point is it can change also its even shapes, but mainly colors and especially timing, like how that might be behaving as the effect starts, does its thing, and closes up. Because usually, just like in the animation, we have a beginning, middle, and the end. And in games, for example, especially, it is important that these do feel kind of like that it's possible to loop them or possible to combine them in a way that's, because it could be that someone does multiple same effects at the same time, so that it feels also that it's continuous. So it's not something that just like starts glitching on the screen or it looks like glitch. So that's why visual hierarchy is extremely important for, again, communicating that movement or action or whatever we are doing on the screen. And so these are some most common things to keep in mind for real time, because again, this happens in real time. This is as the players are playing. Now think about the games like, I mean, any kind of multiplayer games from World of Warcraft to League of Legends or whatever, and the amount of different players, again, with their effects and everything else, like how that all is being not just big mess, which again can be, but that can be also kind of like the gist of it, but still to be clear enough and accessible enough, no matter how many players you might have. There is also, besides the technical requirements, there is also a reason why we don't want certain amount of players at the time to do something in a specific space. For example, usually you don't have more than 10 players on a server in majority of cases, like majority again, but yeah. Yes. Now, let's see how it works. So, every effect can literally be done in many ways, literally thousands of ways. So there is no very one way to do something. It's more like, again, following the animation usually, or following what message you want to give. So based on that, you might decide to do something simpler, more complex, whatever, again, the main message that would be. But whatever you do, you should be at least trying to make the same effect by using camera facing cards. So that means that you're basically using like how the effects where they're actually facing, which again in games usually is where the camera setting of the player is. So it's usually following that. So basically it's always facing the player no matter what effect happens. At least that's kind of like the main view, because that's what players are seeing. And then meshes are, you will see also soon, this is also something we spoke a bit with the rigging and animating, but basically this is also where we use meshes of this sort of, you can decide, again, shapes and rules of how certain effects would be moving. For example, this swoop of a sword, again, it could be doing some sort of loop, it can be doing also, so you are deciding what kind of behavior would be through these meshes. And then we have trails. That's pretty much like in this, like, how is it ending? How is the effect ending? So just like in animation, when we have sort of like the trails of it. So what is the basically the tail of, like, the final kind of where some effect might disintegrate or disappear? And pretty much what only thing really matters is how does it look as a final thing. So if something feels good, even with simpler options, go for it. If you want to complicate it, also go for it. Like, it really is up to you. Just like when you think about math, certain equations, I mean, you can come to a solution in various ways, but as long as you get the right answer, really is what we need. So how you do it, that's why also in the, let's say, schooling or education for visual effects and so on, usually, again, they are part of more animation and kind of like also in the movie and film, not just generally film studies, but they do tend to also be, of course, part of some of the game development studies, although I am not aware of any official trainings in Finland other than private courses or online courses and stuff like that. But basically, again, more experienced VFX artists would be just teaching, and plus internet is full of courses, of course, even free stuff on YouTube. The main thing is to really be, if this is something, just like with technical art, if this is something that is your personal interest, there's no other way to do it than start doing it. And then you just learn as you go, which is quite often, even with coding, let's be honest, there, because someone can show you stuff, but at the end you have to figure out the solution, especially as software developers who are solving the challenges and figuring out stuff, on the go. Because as mentioned before, or I'm not sure if I mentioned it in this class, but it's very important from the development side to understand that game developers are not always software developers. And that's something to really be aware of, that game developers usually use existing engines, not literally that, but they're not software developers. They don't solve things like that. They're in the teams, there would be software developers to handle then all this stuff, how to put things together, but actual game programmers are not software developers very often. So this is something that is also misconception, that's thinking that if someone is game developer, even if they're coding within the engine, they don't do actual software development. But yeah, at the end of the day, really what matters, just like with the animation, is that how does it feel? Is it clear enough? Does it follow, especially the rest of the animation movements and so forth? So all of this is something that, how does it click? And it's lots of vibe, kind of like based on the vibes, which I know doesn't help much. But if our senses see that, hey, this feels good, that's all that matters. How you get there, that is really up to you. Now let's see. Come on, we can do this. All right. So here are some principles how we usually do the movements with the VFX. So as mentioned, particle effects are the most common way of handling any kind of VFX, because again, you can in the particle system control all these things when it comes to also shapes, mesh, all of the stuff that how things move around. So usually what that means is that we have emitter, which is a point where effect starts from. And then there is the space or the environment in which this effect takes place. Or at least we are feeling that this is taking certain space. But of course, most of it, especially, for example, in 2D, is just an illusion of stuff. And then a lot of manipulation. So basically, we manipulate options in the particle systems. So when you think about even just having water as, like the liquid. So how, if the water, spreads out, if reacts to gravity, if there is some splashes, if any kind of colliding stuff, especially with the extra bursts may happen and so on to the surfaces of the water and so forth and so forth. So basically, you can make this all, again, more believable when it comes to the effect itself. But everything starts somewhere, and ends somewhere. That's basically within usually the spawning part of it's usually invisible point in space. So you will see soon on some example. But basically, usually the effect starts from somewhere, it does its thing, and then disappears. Or it can be reoccurring looping thing that keeps going if you have a need for the effect of that. Like, let's say, a fountain. So again, if you just have fountain and water going around, that's just a looping thing. All right, I'm gonna share now the list and also ask, oopsie, sorry about this. This is not the one. Managing two computers. There we go. This should be correct. I hope so. And here. So meanwhile, I'm giving the appendix. Any questions about these things so far? Comments? Or anything unclear? All right. If not, let's move on. So now we can look at this. So I said already, immediate part. So basically, where the effect starts from. So if we look at now I have two screens, so I'm gonna try like this. Let's see, does this work? So even if something would be starting from, like, it's still going from some invisible place. So it's not actually, so we're just making sure that the effect starts from somewhere, and that can be the full even area, just like in this one, or it can be like sword. It is also an area. Now, usually with the effects that we do, so if something is, let's say, like this sort of explosion going through, like, or emitting kind of like forward, that is usually a one-time thing that might happen. Again, depends what is going on, but it's usually something like that would be a one-time effect based on whatever movement. It can be repeating with the movement, but it follows the movement. So every time you go let's say, you go berserk, kind of like with your character, and goes, and then kind of there is this sort of extra, and then the animation continues. But it can be something that happens within the space that could continue, let's say portals or whatever else, or it can be surrounding the whole object, like the case of the magical sword, for example, that this is something that it's looping and going around the object. So also what it follows is not just the object, not just the object of the like the social, but also if the whatever happens with that object, meaning that someone is actually using the sword, it would be also following the whole thing connected to it. Or it could be that if that sword now, let's say if you just don't even hit, but you just maybe turning towards someone, and then suddenly if that specific thing happens, it can trigger that there would be some special effect also going towards the enemy or whatever else. Or in the case of the shield, as the shield would also have this kind of thing following it. In case of smack, maybe something bigger happens. Maybe there comes the bubble, like this sort of around the character that, or maybe something else kind of like from the effects might come to highlight again, to communicate that what is the power of, for example, the shield now that it has special powers. But all of these, as you can see, if we go back here, so we have a spot of its start, and then basically options for these particle systems. So they start from somewhere, and they can be also starting loop like this, or it can be area, a whole area of where something happens. And then they do their thing, and then they disappear. But again, in a looping way, usually, so that it can be just something static again when it comes to the portals in this case. So that's one thing, but also, as you can see, these arrows here, the direction of the effect. So let's say that this one comes from the character forward. But what happens if something else is around? Would that be affected by it? Would it not be affected by it? So if we think about the games, like last time we had screenshots of Remedy's game, or actually I can go back here to Hades. So there's all of these highlights and everything as these areas down that you can see and so on. Like these are different type of effects that we put on, but especially when it comes to this, even with the lighting systems of these little flares that are around in the environment and so on and so on. So do they affect each other? That's a question. Like they don't have to, but maybe that is something you want to happen. So this kind of colliders also is something that we can then also add to, because direction of the visual effect can have really huge impact to, again, communicate whatever it is in addition to the movement that we have. Because sometimes it can be that you want to actually remember with the animation that we said that quite often we need to cut things because, again, we are especially in the interactive media, so we need to optimize and cut as much as we possibly can. So if you have a choppy animation, but if you add extra spice on it with this kind of particle stuff, which are very light usually when it comes to performance, again, usually, or should be, and just changing the intensity or changing the colors and the sort of shapes or however, like you can already like add to that animation to be way more believable and way more empowering, or just generally giving more information, which is then cheaper in a way of performance. So we are always trying to see where can we have less performance-wise situation that some blockage can happen, and that's why VFX, for example, help us a lot to do this, and so have a very good representation of things, but not burn the again, not melt the computer while using while playing. Now, I already mentioned this with the firewall. So most common methods and using the kind of bullet particle firewall. So particle effects is literally what its name says. You have a particle. Now the particle can be, usually when we say particle, we think of the, grain of sand or something like that. But the particle can be a full object. It doesn't have to be something that is fine. It can be all sorts of stuff. So basically, that's why when we use particle effects, we can use them for a variety of things and we can layer them up. So just like in animation, usually we have three main parts. So we have the primary, secondary, and tertiary read. So if we look at the most commonly kind of like the fireball kind of as an example of, we have the main head of the fireball, and that's something that usually has the brightest or biggest kind of like visual intensity when it comes to what we want someone to focus on. So usually that's the main object, which in this case would have extra things happening on top of the object itself. So this would be the main body of the object. And then we have the ribbon, that can be basically done out of tiling. So if you, let me see, can I do this on both? So think about that here would be, I don't know, does this show my mouse, but just right after the head, this central part, which is more orangey. So in here, this part. So think about it as a modular stuff. So this could be done in a way that it could be literally done as a tiling, as a textured tiling, because sometimes this could be done like longer sequences of things, or it can be shorter. So you can tile them up. At least that's what we usually try to do if we need something to be like repeated. And so that's one thing that we usually have, we call it ribbon. Usually that's kind of something that is, so that ribbon can be as short as long as you basically need it. And then that ribbon stops, or the final part, the third part is, of course, the follow-up. Just like we had the follow-through animations, so something is, first of all, it follows the second, so it follows the ribbon, the way how the movement goes. But the shapes and everything, so it's starting to kind of, so it's a way lower detail in a way that compared to, for example, head, where it's like it's basically disappeared. And this is where you can even have these extra sparks. And so think about the fire, like fireplace. So you can have fire, fire does its thing. Of course, the most intense thing is in the core of the fire, and then the rest goes. And then as it goes, you could even give these little sparks of how the, you know, like things are. So again, just to give more believable behavior. But of course, just like with everything else, don't overdo it. When basically, that's where also usually what we do in VFX is similar what we do with animation. If you remember the principle of solid drawing, so that means that just like in animation, that in every angle that something would be taking place, the movement, it's recognizable. What is the object? How is it? What is going on? So I would recommend to always have very, like, it doesn't have to be detailed, but just sketch like this sort of the form of how something will be behaving, because that is going to help you a lot to really see what you really need and what could be like avoided. Because again, we want to have things as simple as possible, and more doesn't always mean better. Just saying. So that's something to be aware of with, especially with VFX. Even that we all love a good big bang, but even there, what makes the bang? Like, what is the actual thing that is the most epic about it? So these are the parts with the timing, with all that. But pretty much all the VFX have these principles. So you have usually 3 parts. So where's the main intensity? So this is where kind of, in this case, head, but think about it as a head, body, tail. It's very easy to kind of think about that for any. So even if we go here, each of those have head, body, and tail, even if it's looping one. Because even when the things are looping, they have to loop in a way that they end with basically way of starting where the main thing starts. So basically, it kind of like, it should be like snake eating own tail kind of thing. That it would be the head connects to the tail when you think about these three principles. And that's when we do this sort of like looping things that happens around certain object. And yeah, sketching it with 3 lines basically to figure out that sort of like it's more than enough quite often. But this is what majority of VFX actually is all about. So even when we think about way more complex VFX, they still use this kind of approach. So you have a main thing, you have the secondary or the middle part, and then you have the ending. And as mentioned, you can layer these. So that's a super fun part because not everything has to be done in that one effect. You can layer the effects. And that's again something that I mean, I remember some of the, okay, so for 3D modelers, it is so sad. Sometimes it happens. Especially, I think I listened to one talk of, I can't remember, was it Assassin's Creed or what was I can't remember which dev was talking about. And it's like, so they did some, I don't know what amazing, um, I mean, like the 3D modeling and even animation of some character, like it was some monster or something. It doesn't matter. And the point is that then VFX artists came in and made all this kind of kaboom because and you can barely see that character and their marvelous animations. And it was so sad, like how he was so expressing himself. And then VFX artists came and everything we did, you can't even see anymore. It was so cute. But again, it was looking amazing. So at the end, but it's just like, it can happen. It can happen that sometimes the effects take over. Shouldn't happen, but it can, again, depending on the art direction. So talk to your 3D model. So they are also happy at the end. All right. Now, we spoke about all of these things, and now how do we actually make this communicating even more clear? Surprise, surprise. Shapes, colors, timing. So let's go with shapes. We already spoke about shapes in the beginning, so now it's getting even more important, like the amount of different varieties that we might need to use them. So all the effects usually are made out of specific shapes that they are representing, maybe to match the animation movements, shape of movement, maybe the characters, again, shape language. It can be anything that's either, but it needs to be, usually it's a continuing with that kind of visual communication forward. And quite often they are the collection of shapes. So the particle system, for example. So as mentioned, the particle can be, a dust particle kind of thing, like a little ball, but it can also be any shape you think about, literally. And most commonly we use the basic shapes, obviously, but we can also even use, like in 3D, even more kind of like different kind of shapes that would be the part. And you might have noticed also in the games you are playing that quite often when, let's say, your character collects health, that there might be thinking like something, either the cross or a heart or something that is kind of coming out of, like, your health is being restored. So that's where also the communication of what is actually happening. So you're getting health, depending on how you are presenting that. Is it a med kit or is it a heart that you collect in the world? So that might be the shape you would be using then for communicating that you are restoring your health, for example. And again, that's kind of like having the particles itself. So they can be any shapes and sizes even, but also the shape of the effect area. So just like we had this sort of like with this kind of several different examples of, different effects that might be, literally the shape of the area that this effect is taking place is also a really important thing to decide. Like, again, it's not always just oval thing that happens with insert. It can be also different shapes and sizes. And just like with the rest of the environment, of the character design, of everything we do with the designing, especially art direction and recognizable visual language for that particular product, this is also where we need to create a standardized rules, what would be used for what kind of effects, what kind of basically, what is again the message? So very commonly for health, as mentioned, you can have hearts, crosses. Damage can be this kind of like more of a shapes of kind of like some sort of triangular stuff. And then any protective things could be more of a oval or squarey or anything in between, kind of closed shapes, which again, it's about the shielding. And again, this is just, obviously you can break all these rules, but it's most common because that's something that is cross-culturally being understood even from basic kind of like communications. But that's also why it is so important to have this standardized language for also this of what effects we'll be doing, because that has to give again more information to the player. And now let's talk about the color. So this is a tricky one. And the reason why it's tricky is because we already spoke about, all the, importance of the contrast, especially, complementary colors, things where they're like making sure things are clear for the, along with the shapes, but also colors then really make sure that all is, especially for accessibility because of the color blindness or any other, again, it's a spectrum, so it's like what kind of visual possibly unclear things might be. So this is also where we have to figure out how can we communicate this even clearer with the effects. This is super tricky on mobile. So the thing with the mobile, especially mobile games, because we have very small screen actually that we deal with. And if you think about any match 3 game, because I'm sure that at least some moment in your life you played at least one. So the tiles themselves will have their own colors. The effects there might be that they might have if you boost them up or something will also have some effects on, like with own, again, shape and color. And then what if there are two in between? And what if when some other effect happens and the explosion happens, then it's again very clear which area is being destroyed and how that whole thing works. So now why I'm saying this is super tricky on mobile, because on the smaller screen, it is so easy that these things mix up, because especially particle effects. So a lot of testing, I can tell you in one of our games that we did at the time, even that we did initial tests with the tile colors, that those would be like different boxes. So I can't remember now, there were like 5 or 7 different colors. And apparently some players found difficult to distinguish between yellow and red. And I need to explain this because our color palette for these tiles were more kind of like softer, like not pastel-y, but softer palettes. So it is understandable that actually certain warmer yellow for certain, again, especially on a small device, could be very close to lighter kind of also kind of darker orangey reds, because now like from that, but of course for the that's not a very common, actually that's not a very common issue with the color blindness spectrum that we usually work with. So it just took extra testing to make sure that we find the right shades, even of the main colors, to work with. So don't assume, again, it's good to test and figure out and so on. And because these things can overlap and be very confusing, it is also super important that the shape language then kicks in to help out. So for example, if we look back to this, if you think about particles, let's say I'm getting health, and then I get damaged. So let's say I'm getting the, what is it called? The cross, maybe it's green, or it might be bright blue. Again, bright blue would be much better. And then as I am getting attacked or something happens, that would be more like reddish orange or so. So definitely no color, because as mentioned before, green and red is something that we don't use anymore as the kind of like the damage, compared to the green being kind of like restoring and so on. So we usually use light blues instead of green when we go like correct and then incorrect, or being the damage or whatever. So we are trying to kind of, so these are the new best practices. Let me see. So that's why shapes will help. So even if we have something that is the same, might be the same or close enough shades of certain colors, at least the shapes will tell us, okay, this belongs to that, that belongs to that. So it's going to be clear, at least in that way. And when we think about the, let's say, not just in games, but also in movies, and especially superheroes are quite good example for this. If you have, for example, a specific colored character, or their effect also is specific kind of like, so they can be, there could be even whole colors of teams. Like think about even, you know, you have your troop, or you have your horde, or you have your, or you just have your team, like you play soccer, like you have your teams, you know, colors and so on. So these also then need to be tweaked to make sure that it's not mistaken for something else. And especially their spells, their elements, any kind of like also emotional tone there might be. Again, is it a villain? Is it, you know, the good or the bad kind of thing? Or what is the, again, the message there? Because you can add to it. Think about, again, animated movies and stuff, like, for example, Disney. If you think about Maleficent from like the at least the original Disney's Sleeping Beauty. So that particular green that follows her everywhere, even as a kind of like, even that she has, well, she has a green face, but other than that, the rest, there's no green. So that's something that follows through, like as a, especially those are mostly kind of effects that would be in the game or interactive, that would be the effects. So you can literally use VFX for that emotional tone, to kind of like bring up more attention to things and so on. So again, villain, in the case of villain. Same thing goes with the representation of any purity, like usually again something with white and so forth. But then we are usually trying not to have too much color to the effects, at least trying. But just enough to be clearly identified what it stands for. So, and also to be very clear for, usually, let's say in game development or software, we usually even put the majority of our particle, like the designs are completely white. So the particle that I would give the shape or combination of those to my coder will most likely be white or with some gradient, so that we can tweak the color in the engine. So that's also something that we do quite often. So that means that if the colors change, I don't need to have gazillion new versions of the particles. It does automatically thing in the code. So that's kind of the thing that, so again, even like the actual assets usually are basically white, because from white we change the colors, or then gradient. So again, if you have some special stuff that they might have some shapes and things with the shadowing, then you can have it as a gradient, and then you just change the colors on the go. So that's quite common. And now the timing. So if we look at this for a moment, so this is what I meant by you have different characters, each of them have their specific color combinations and shapes and powers, and they represent elements, and it's a whole shebang. And then their effects. So just look for a moment the variety, even that it might seem too close by, but these are very carefully tweaked of the shape of the effect, the intensity of certain colors, the especially kind of compared to the red, all these yellows here, and then even the blues, especially with the one with the snowflakes compared to the one with more of a let's say the electric kind of effect and so on. And so basically they could like feel similar, but at the same time, like this one has bubbles and so on. So we're trying always to add and layer out these things that it would be clear. So when you have all of these characters roaming around and, you know, doing their magic around, it's clear who is doing what, where stuff happens, who is handling what, or at least clear enough. Like this is the as clear as we can go, basically. But of course, there will be moments when mayhem happens on the screen, and you let it roll out. And I will just check, is there, yeah. Now the timing is super weird, because again, lots of vibes can happen with the timing. And when someone feels that something feels good, might not be for others. So that's why, yeah. But anyway, just like in animation, if nothing else, following the animation timing, it's always good educated guess if you don't know. But if we think about, so basically quite often animators and especially VFX artists, like VFX artists, you will see those wild creatures around areas. Literally, if you see maybe going somewhere around lakes, and if you see someone just literally, first of all, looking like a nerd, most likely, but also throwing the rocks into the pond, most likely they're studying, figuring out something that is most likely giving them a headache at work. So that's what we do. We usually literally go and observe. There's no other way to do it. And to try to figure out certain way of rules. Now, of course, the kind of like some like the point with the understanding how, for example, certain movements go is that in the case when you throw a rock into the water, the area gets bigger. So we have the moment of that this time it's not necessarily invisible, because we know the entry point of the rock, and depends how shallow thing, maybe a rock just like literally even stays there, and then the ripples will start. Now, in the beginning, it's gonna be a big splash, and these ripples will be bigger, and basically as soon as they reach maximum size, they disappear or they blend into the environment. So the timing, for example, is also that closer to the impact, we usually have faster type of movement. So we have more of these kind of things happening. And the further it goes away, it slows down until it disappears. Similar with the animation of the ball that we had. So we have, if you just throw a ball and let it like slowly gets closer, small, and then it starts just rolling off until it fully stops. So similarly to approach the timing in visual effects. And yeah, if nothing else, next time you are by any kind of water that you would be throwing some pebbles in or stones or whatever, and if this is something that is interests you as visual effects, this is where it's the best place to basically learn the timing by observing how something feels. When Horizon Zero Dawn developers were figuring out, I can post that link. I think their talk is available on YouTube. It's incredible talk. It's mind blowing what they did with vegetation in the Horizon Zero Dawn. So apparently they did the full system of the trees, leaves, how they behave with the natural environments that they're there, because they have the cycles with winds and even rain and everything else. And for those who played, especially when it just came out, they had mind-blowing snow, walking through a snow shader, which literally felt like you are in the snow walking. There was not that sort of usual tracks. It was, the snow was behaving as it would in real life, and that was absolutely mind-blowing. So basically, they were saying that they had basically teams excursions just sitting in parks to observe the movements, like to really learn, because this is something that you can't, nobody can tell you, oh, this is how you do this. You have to really feel that what does that happen in the, like how big trees, how they like all of this stuff. And they made full systems for it. It's just, again, I'm like, it's uncanny what they achieved. And then of course with Horizon Forbidden West later just went full in even more. Yeah, but that was one of the bigger technical achievements at the time, because the things they did in general animation and effects, just for environment. Again, it's not even talking about the characters and so on. And so it was really, really stunning. But this is the way how we get these vibes, meaning like there's no, you can, of course, when there are things like, I think with more stylized expression and art style. So when you think about, of course, pixel or any low poly things or anything like that, or simplified, more kind of like abstract 2D, of course you can then, according to that, it's more simplified, it's more abstract, and it will work together. But the more vibes come actually when you have to do more realistic things, which makes kind of contradictory when you think about it. But because again, we are tricking our senses, that's really what we are doing. So, and there's no other way to trick it than really see what it feels like, what are the vibes of it. But if you're doing something more abstract or more kind of simplified, then you have way more kind of like, then you can just even have systems in place that would be repeatable and looping, and it will be good enough and it's fine. But yeah, I think more realistic things require more vibes, which is so weird. But yeah, that's how it goes. So, any questions about any of these? Shape, color, timing? Anything that is maybe unclear or online? All right, I'll take silence as a, I think. And now, let's summarize a bit. So, just like with technical art, not dedicated VFX studies are really there. Again, you might have some private maybe courses, even calling themselves universities and so, because again, private universities, but not really as a, like you can have, again, there are ways to go and train, but usually it's very specific course based. not something that is full program per se, at least not yet. And might be by now, I don't know, like again, different country, but at least in Finland, not really. And pretty much the main thing is to try things out, be curious, because if this is something that is interesting for you and you want to explore more, just again, try it out. Trust me, simple is better. Like you don't need to complicate stuff. And again, especially unlike technical art, this is more artsy side. So that's where it allows you more kind of like, we can trick more things. So unlike with like if something works or doesn't work, that's kind of straightforward. But here we can actually trick the brain and trick the viewer in various ways that again what feels good. And knowing the animation principles helps a lot. So this is something to be aware of. Always, even in the more complex VFX thing, we always try to have simple systems in place. And then we can layer it out, have more stuff on top of it, and even expand its complexity, but do start with the basics. So pretty much like the slide with kind of like characters. So basically just main effect, just know that this is actually working, and then you can pick up forward. Now with what we have here with the CGI and so forth in the mocap. So basically, as I mentioned last time, in the mocap system, so here's the actor with a full bodysuit and the facial system in place. So you can see that there are also the dots for very specific micro movements of the muscles, because the actual everything is actually following actors acting. So all of these are done then post-production in fixing up. Now, of course, the amount of data that we get from these suits can be really large and also complex, and so there is usually someone who cleans stuff up. Nowadays, at least back in the day when we were doing more, even in my team, more of mock-up things, especially for VR, it was slightly more janky system. Of course, nowadays I wouldn't be surprised that nowadays even there might be some AI system that would clean up these unnecessary things. But we usually did all of that manually, especially because sometimes even system, if you clean up, it could remove something actually important. So it's good to always give it a go, especially when it comes to micro movements like facial expressions or specific gestures and so on. So that's where the details are, like that's where the kind of, because as mentioned in the staging and the way how we control the camera for storytelling and so on, usually the camera is further away to show the action while zooms in for emotion. That's the most common way we communicate. So just like we see here, the focus on the ape's face is about the emotion, the reaction to something. And that's why basically micro movements are so important to track of what actor does, and then adjust it to now the model of the ape, which thankfully it's very close to the human, so that's not a problem then to adjust. But for example, if you have, I'm sure you watched Hobbit, Lord of the Rings movies and generally there. So when Cumberbatch, for example, was playing the dragon, he was also actually like this playing the dragon with all the facial things, and they were then putting his facial movements on the dragon. So that's a bit more kind of like, which they did an incredible job, obviously, but so there could be even more struggles for you as a VFX artist and figuring out the whole thing, what would be, how things would be moving on top of, from one mesh to another mesh kind of thing. Because again, data can be tricky there. But it's also fun. It is fun. and I think we still have mockup suit in Turbo Game Hub, and it should be just like you can just come and try things out, so it shouldn't be a like, especially for kind of like, you know, just test things there. Or or if it's not available, someone borrowed it. But again, the point is it's there, so one can learn things there. And I think it might be that Tuas or Turkuas nowadays, they might also have, I don't know, if maybe someone here from Tuas can tell us if there is still there something, or did they completely, because I have heard that they are also closing GameStop there, so let's see. But anyway, if interested in any of this, happy to introduce you to people who do it. And there are plenty of places you can play around and try things out. But yeah, so for CGI, this is also where lots of things, again, as you know, in superhero movies and so on, most of these are just jumping around some cranes and things in a green studio, and the rest happens in the engines. So the whole half of Mandalorian is done in Unreal Engine, for example. Although it's very admirable that they did lots of props with actual kind of like toy stuff and mechanics, and then combined it with the CGI or with the full Unreal Engine implementation. So yeah. So that's the thing. These skills are not just for IT, gaming, whatever. These are needed now pretty much everywhere. And as mentioned, more and more kind of like other industries are in need of this knowledge. So it's really good to be, if nothing else, eloquent in these, at least to know how things work. And yeah, do we now have any questions or comments on VFX, especially those maybe who did do some VFX? Anything to add, or maybe share your thoughts, your experiences? I can read them out if you write it down. Otherwise, I have a question. So after this, does anyone consider at least trying VFX? At least one. A few. How about online? Oh, yes. There was a comment. Very easy to forget about less is more rule when working with VFX. Yes. And especially if you are maximalist like I am, I love pretty complex things. Let me put it this way. If you would know me more, like as a person, like you would know also that I collect antiques, for example, which is maximalism all the way, mostly like Italian stuff and so on. So yeah, then compared to IKEA world, which we have in the Nordics, this is where kind of like, yeah, it would be like, it's always for me a problematic thing to, you know, stop myself with less is more, especially when it comes to animation and VFX. But it's again, it is part of the practice, and also scope. Like, and also the thing is that, you know, there are battles you need to, there are other fires to handle. So yeah, this is something that you always know, like, I don't have more time for this. Whatever comes in next 8 hours is gonna be the thing. So sometimes that's it, especially as an indie, like, good enough, let's go. And yeah, especially if you are planning to come to Global Game Jam or something during, or any jams in the upcoming year, there will be plenty. That's another place where you could try different tools, different things, and especially surrounded with devs and equipment and everything else, especially at the Game Hub. So everyone will be there also to, like, you can just explore around and try different things. So yeah, let me see, do I have, I think that's my, yeah, this is the last slide. Yes. So that's VFX as short as I can go. And like, you can try, if nothing else, using in any engine, any place, I mean, even Game Maker, RPG Maker and so on, even they do it. So it's like, you don't even have to do the coding to do some of these things. But of course, if any game engine would be great, Unity, Unreal, Godot, whatever, to try stuff around. And again, simple, please try simple. And you will see once you start, things start pulling, and then it's like, oh, it's so cute. And then you start enjoying yourself. And then, yeah. And then you start complicating, and then you learn, oh no, I have to teach myself that. And it's a journey, but at least it is a fun journey, I can tell you that. And especially seeing something on the screen when everything clicks together with, you know, things just like literally click together in the right way, in the right, like it's just so satisfying, at least for the developer. And there, yeah, we have also comment 100% is fun every time. Yay! So yeah, good. We have some enthusiasts in the house with experience. That's amazing. So yeah, anything to ask or any other? Alrighty then. Then we were super effective today. So that's it for the lesson itself. And we meet next Tuesday, same time, same place. And thank you for today. And have an amazing weekend because we are almost there. Thank you. Stop recording.